just while we wait for the people who are just still getting their way into the online event, there's a little question there. What is the most common length of time for your meetings? And if you go onto slido.com, it's very, very easy if you've never done it before. You'll be asked to put in a hashtag, put in hashtag WinR, and you can answer that question. And then later, Lucinda is going to share with us for you what is the most common length of time for your meetings. So welcome, everybody. It is now well and truly 10 o'clock. This is our first Women in Research for the year, which seems strange given that you're already in March. But welcome, it's absolutely wonderful to have you. We're going to talk today about meetings. And it's interesting, actually, and I'm just rambling a little bit here just to give people a bit of time to get into the session. It's interesting, though, when I started preparing for this topic, it's actually quite a huge topic. I thought it would be a nice little quick, simple topic. And I think that's because, as I'll talk about in a minute, we spend so much time in meetings, so much frustration about the time we do spend in meetings. So it's actually quite a big topic. I also think it's the forum when leadership takes place, you know, because most of the meetings, you know, with our bosses, our leaders, you know, that is where they can exercise their leadership. So we're going today to talk about how to hold effective meetings, and I'm delighted to introduce to you one of the inaugural ARC Laureate Fellows, Jenny Martin, and I'll introduce her to you a little bit later. But just as we are kicking off, remember to mute your microphone, but we do love to see you. You can message our support team in chat if you have any problems. And as ever, I encourage you to be a little bit self-indulgent, which women rarely do, but just focus on you and take some time to reflect this morning about this topic and your role in it. I'd like to, at this point, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, and that's the land of the Woodchuck people in the Perth region. And I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution that they make to this city and this region. And please feel free to share on chat the land on which you are on today. So we will stick with our normal format this morning. So first of all, I'm going to share with you some of the research around good meetings, and then we will hear from Jenny, and then we will have questions from Lucinda. And again, feel free to submit questions on the chat or via Slido as we go. Before we get into meetings, I do just want to remind you of the importance of this series is called Small Wins. And it's fundamentally about whatever it is that we're trying to achieve, whatever that big goal is, that top of the hill thing that we're aspiring to, actually thinking about what are the small steps that we can take to get there, and breaking down those big goals into manageable small things and creating those positive small habits. So I'm going to ask you a little bit later, you know, after I've presented some of my thoughts from the evidence, what's the small thing you're going to change about meetings, the way you run meetings or behave in meetings based on what we've discussed? So be ready for that question a little bit later. So let's ask the question, should we just eradicate meetings? This quote here, I have way too many meetings. Joe, nearly everybody, employee, nearly every company, comes from the book that I'm going to share with you in a minute about the science of meetings. And the fact is that we have a huge number of meetings. So some research suggests that non-managers average about 11 to 15 meetings per week. And this was in 2018. So I think actually the numbers have increased since then. CEOs or senior people have as many, if not more than 37 meetings per week. And there's some evidence actually that we're spending more time in meetings. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's partly because organisations are trying to be more inclusive and trying to involve people more in decisions. And of course, that inevitably means more meetings. Actually, some research, I only have it for the USA, unfortunately, shows that about 8% of GDP is invested in meeting time. So a huge amount of billions and billions of dollars are spent through meetings. The other thing about meetings, I guess, is it is a source of frustration for many people. And there's some research that when you ask people, what was their biggest source of frustration, it's, the meetings, and that they are the #1 time waster. So you can see there's some research there from Stephen Rogelberg that just shows that, only 17% rating their meetings as very good to excellent. So I guess in the light of this, one solution might be, well, let's just get rid of meetings. And I certainly know organisations that say, well, we won't have any meetings on Monday, or we'll do something like that to control the number of meetings. But as I said before, meetings are really important. Key decisions are made in meetings. They are a way to include people. And of course, they also, a good meeting, there's nothing like a good meeting for fostering that sense of we've got a shared goal, we're a shared sense of purpose. So it's not really about eradicating meetings, but I think it's about creating more effective meetings. And that's what we're going to focus on here this morning. I'm going to draw especially on this book by Professor Stephen Rogelberg, and he is a colleague of ours. He is a organisational psychologist who sort of consolidated some of the evidence around meetings into this book, which is a great book. And some of you ask the question, what do I do if I've got a boss who's bad at running meetings? Or maybe you buy them this book for Christmas. I also am going to draw quite a lot on this other paper mentioned here, which was a sort of summary of the academic research on meetings. So let me ask the question, first of all, to you. Are you running effective meetings? And interestingly, the research shows here that if you're somebody who talks the most in meetings, which is often, by the way, the leader, you're more likely to rate the meeting as positive. And the other people are likely to rate the meeting as less effective. In other words, you go to a meeting, you talk a lot, you convey what you want, and you come out feeling it was a great meeting. But in fact, you'll probably find that some of the other people in the meeting are not having that same experience. So I guess the first thing I would encourage you to do is just engage in some honest self-reflection. So, the next time you have a meeting, think about, were people distracted? Were there side conversations? Who talked the most? Was it you? Was it one or two other dominant people? Did you stay on topic? And so on and so forth. And even ask for some feedback. There's nothing wrong in spending the last 5 minutes of the meeting saying, I want to improve how I run meetings. How did I go today? How did we go as a team? What could we do differently or better? So that's the first point, is if you're sitting there thinking, oh, my meetings are great, just do a little bit of self-reflection. So let's look, first of all, at how do we set up a meeting, because that's part of the battle, right? And the first thing is be clear why you're having the meeting and prepare accordingly. This sort of sounds like an obvious point, but sometimes we slip into that habit of just having meetings because they're scheduled, and we don't really actually know why we're having the meeting. So, first of all, be very clear why you're having it and prepare accordingly. Of course, if all you're going to do at the meeting is disseminate information, that could probably be done by email. Maybe you don't need a meeting. So have that little think around what are you trying to achieve with this meeting and prepare accordingly. Invite who needs to be there. And I think Stephen Rogelberg in the book talks about, you don't want spectators at a meeting. You want people who need to be there and who need to be involved in according to the purpose that you have for the meeting. One of the areas of research here shows that if you have an agenda, the meeting is rated as more effective. So it's such a simple thing. It can be agenda that you prepare beforehand and circulate, ideally allowing participants to contribute. Or it can even just be an agenda that at the beginning of the meeting you quickly formulate, and again, allow people to contribute and add different items to the agenda. So, the evidence shows if you've got an agenda, then it actually will help with your meeting success. And of course, not an agenda like this cartoon here, a meaningful agenda. Stephen in his book talks about, think carefully about the time and place, because there is some evidence that if you're in a nice environment, the meeting is actually rated as more effective. And it's also important to think about variety, mixing it up a little bit, because again, you want to try and keep meetings fresh and not just sort of routinized and everyone's bored because they know what's happening. You know, you might have a standing meeting or a walking meeting. Of course, they need to be a bit shorter. Or you might sometimes meet in your office, but sometimes meet in the person you're meeting with, their office, and so on. So think about mixing up where you have that meeting. Variety is a spice. Okay, so I like this quote. I'm pretty sure the dinosaurs died out when they stopped gathering food and started having meetings to discuss gathering food. So, you know, there's a lot of these quotes about meetings being a waste of time, and I guess that's what we're trying to address with our session today. One important question, and we got a few questions about this from you guys, is, well, what's the right size for meetings? And I guess Stephen talks about in his book, and he draws on the research here on social loafing, that ideally there's no more than around 7 people. Now, what is social loafing? If you're a psychologist, you will already know this. If you look at the little picture here that I've put up on the screen, what research shows is that the more people that you have trying to achieve a goal, the less hard any single individual works. And that's this phenomenon of social loafing. So you can see the little picture there where with the 3 people pulling the rock, you know, are likely to each only put in 85% of effort, where the only person pulling the rock, then that's they're more likely to put in 100% of effort. Doesn't mean this always happens. You can do things to overcome this phenomenon. But this is the sort of natural human tendency, I guess, is if there's a lot of other people around to do stuff, you know, we all have a little bit of a natural tendency to go, yeah, okay, let's let them help as well. So when we're creating meetings, if we're having loads and loads of people there, we're going to increase the likelihood that this social loafing phenomenon happens. And how many times have we been in an online meeting with 20 people or so, and, you know, probably 15 of them are doing their emails, and there's only a small number of dominant people engaged. So think very hard about the number of people. Now, this, you know, I said before that meetings are about trying to include people. So how do we actually include people in a way, but also keep meetings small? Well, think creatively about that, right? So if there is sort of people that you think, you know, that might want to be included in this meeting, you might allow them to put input in beforehand. You might submit the agenda to them and suggest, please share your feedback and I will take it to the meeting. You might give them an opportunity to contribute after the meeting by sharing the minutes and saying, this is what happened in the meeting, please share also your views with us. You might consider more of a representative structure. So rather than all of the postdocs, for example, being involved in a discussion, there might be a representative postdoc whose job it is to take the ideas and gather the ideas of the wider group. So you can think about who do you absolutely need to be there, and then think about some creative ways of involving those other people whose voice you'd like to include. But if the meeting becomes too big, you know, it becomes a non-meeting in a sense. So what else can we do to set up the meeting for success? So here I want to introduce the concept of Parkinson's law, which some of you will be familiar with. And this law is basically, very simply, that we end up taking as long to do a task as we've got. So you can see the little graph here shows that there's a sort of optimal time to do a task, but if you're given more time to do a task, you will often take more time. And how many of us have experienced that, right? I experienced that with this presentation because I usually only prepare the night before, but I actually prepared in advance and I just spent way too long preparing. So I sort of proved Parkinson's law. So where I'm coming to here is we can often make meetings shorter. So we often will schedule meetings for an hour because we think in hours, but they don't need to be an hour. And Lucinda's going to share with me your answer to the question that I posed in Slido. And anyone who missed it, go to slido.com, #WinR, and share with us how long your meetings tend to be. I'll be surprised if they're not mostly an hour, we'll see. But they don't need to be, right? They can be 10 minutes, they can be 15 minutes, they can be any time in between. And actually, Stephen Rogelberg has a chapter in his book saying meet for 48 minutes. And he does that sometimes because he finds that it surprises people to be invited to a meeting for 48 minutes. So that keeps people very tightly on their agenda. Of course, especially if people are in back-to-back meetings, try to finish before those hours or whatever times they are, just to allow a bit of rest. I will share with you, or I don't know, Isabel, if you're able to share it. Somebody sent us some fantastic guidance around making meetings more inclusive. If you can share that on the chat, I can see you nodding. That's fabulous. And that's come from forgotten exactly where, but Isabel will share with you about thinking about inclusive times for meetings, like not school pickup time if possible, and so on. The other thing to think about with meetings is trying to rotate those roles. And a lot of you are asking questions about what if someone's dominant, etc. It can actually help to have these different roles in meetings. There's a chair of the meeting who's in charge of the agenda, and there can even be a separate timekeeper. If you're notoriously going over time, you can even have someone focusing on keeping the meeting to time, because you'll have those agenda items with a time given to them. And one of the things, of course, with these roles is to make sure that they are also not going just to stereotypical ways, that there's always the women taking the minutes or the women organising the catering. So again, if you look into that document that Isabel will share, the importance of rotating those sorts of roles and not having them fall in a stereotyped type of a way. Another thing that you can do also is, if there are some people that are a bit quieter and it's a regular meeting that you have, is, share the agenda items out with people. And it's a great way of people who tend to be a bit quieter, or a bit more introverted, just to say, this is the agenda item I'd like you to speak to. And it's written into the plan, and they know that it's going to happen, and it can be a great way to get voice for those individuals. Here's another one of those quotes: if I die, I hope it's during a staff meeting, because the transition to death could be so subtle. This is what we're trying to avoid. So let's now have a look at what we might do to begin the meeting. So one of the things that's important with a meeting is you're marking a transition between the other work that people have been doing, or the other meeting that they've been in, and your meeting and its clear purpose. So and Stephen in his book talks about trying to create a real positive presence of you're in this meeting. So some music or some food or something like that can actually really help with that transition. Thanking people for coming, welcoming them, creating positive mood. There's research that shows that if people feel positive, have that positive affect in a meeting, then they're more likely to see the meeting as effective. And you're trying to create this separation between what was going on before, whatever's been in other people's heads, and you want to get people really in the moment of this meeting. It can, of course, really help to be clear what is the purpose of the meeting and what are the norms and the expectations of the meeting. It's amazing if you say to people in a meeting, if you're chairing it, and you say to people, can I ask everyone please to be fully present and not be texting or emailing during the meeting. It's amazing that people actually will then comply with that. So establish the norms. You might want to set norms around encouraging people to ask questions, to speak out. So you have an opportunity as a chair to set the tone of your meeting, and research shows that that will really help with the success. So you can see here, I'd like to point out yet again, there is no napping in meetings, which I think is an example of setting the mood. Start the meeting on time. Again, there's you can see there's a paper cited down here that meeting lateness is actually a predictor of people perceiving that the meeting is not actually very successful. So start the meeting on time. You're actually showing that you value people's time. And I put in brackets here stewardship mindset. And this is this idea that as the facilitator of a meeting, you are responsible for a collective group of people's time, which is an enormous privilege, really, because the thing we're all most short on is time. So you are a steward of people's time, and really respecting that is important. And I think when meetings don't start on time, people can think, oh, you're not respecting my time. So, and the other thing is, if you start on time and people are late and they miss out, well, too bad. Next time they'll turn up. And, of course, you can prioritise your items so that you do get to those most important ones first. I just want to show you there's some research where what happens is lots of meetings are videotaped and then transcribed and then analysed in great depth. So that's the sort of research that happens in this space. And that sort of research, you can see an example paper there, shows that the more that the meeting is focused on trying to solve problems, come up with solutions and focus on actions, the more that it's successful. And I just quickly click this. This is the table of beta weights, I think. And you can see these are some of the positive predictors of meeting satisfaction, of team productivity, and of organisation success. So you can see the sort of behaviours here, defining the solution, being solution focused, describing a solution, connecting the problem with a solution is strongly predictive of these outcomes. Connections with a solution, action planning, you can see down here. So I'm going to contrast that with some other behaviours that we see in meetings and show you how they are not so positive. So what you see here is if behaviours in meetings are criticising or running someone down, these are very negatively associated with meeting satisfaction and with organisational success. You can also see complaining and no interest in change. So, we don't want to change that, sort of that passive type of approach. These are also really negatively associated with meeting success. So one of the questions then is if people in the meeting are engaging in these sorts of behaviours, so they're complaining, and this research actually shows, you can see the mean of complaining is pretty high there. Complaining is pretty common in meetings, but it's negative. So what do you do? This piece of research actually shows what's really important. And by the way, they do this by analysing the sequences of language. So they look at complaining and then they measure what happens after complaining, and then they see whether what happens after complaining can actually change. And what this research shows that if you make these procedural statements after complaining or when complaining is happening, actually that can shift the meeting to be more positive. So the sort of things you can do, and these are good things that you can think about if you have these challenges in your own meetings. Things like, all right, back to the topic, or, oh, it's okay, we've voiced our frustration, but let's get back to the topic. Or trying to clarify. So essentially what you're saying is, and summarising it. Well, why don't we talk about X first? And then should I write that down, that issue that you're raising? These sorts of behaviours, trying to get people back on track, are helpful, the research shows, in actually shifting away from complaining, which is negative, to more positive meetings. So these behaviours are something everyone in a meeting can engage in. It doesn't just have to be the leader. So, we now need to come to a decision. We've only got 5 minutes left. Let's vote. Or whatever. Actually, research shows if people are assigned and ideally trained, but at least assigned to help focus on the meeting process, the meeting is more successful. So one thing, if you've got meetings that you regularly have that's maybe going off track or not staying on time, you might actually ask someone to keep the meeting on track. You know, your job is when we go off the rails, when we start complaining or whatever, your job is to bring us back on track, remind us about the goal and purpose of the meeting. And that can actually help. And that's something that that you can do, or you can volunteer to do. If no one asks you, you can volunteer. Would it be helpful if I help keep the meeting on track by, you know, reminding people where we're at? Now, the other big issue in meetings is, of course, the dominance of one individual. And how do you get a little bit more dispersed engagement? It's really interesting research here, if I'm not familiar with it, that people often do not share their unique knowledge. So there've been these very cool experiments done where everybody in the meeting is given some unique knowledge, and also some knowledge that everybody has. And what the research shows is people talk about the knowledge they share, which of course is not very useful because it's actually the unique knowledge. That's often why you bring people together into a meeting, because you want that unique, those diverse views and knowledge. So it's actually worth thinking about. The normal thing we do is, well, let's do some brainstorming. But the research actually shows that quiet brainwriting, so getting people to just individually write down their ideas, is actually more effective than brainstorming. There's less social pressure because you're just writing your ideas down. It's more inclusive because everybody can do it. It's not, again, the more dominant people. And it also can be done in parallel. So, of course, if you're just sharing ideas in brainstorming, only one person can talk at a time, whereas everybody can write down their ideas all at the same time. So think about if this is a challenge in your meetings where some voices are dominant, think about trying to create structures where people write down their ideas and maybe then just share them with the person next to them, something like that. There can be lots of other techniques you can use, you know, put the ideas on the wall and have people walk around and add ideas. You can allow people the chance to read quietly the proposal in the meeting, because how often do we turn up at the meeting when people haven't done their reading and then they're all putting forward ideas and the person saying, but it's in the proposal. Because there's nothing wrong with saying, let's take 15 minutes to quietly read the proposal in the meeting. Of course, promoting engagement comes down to, is strongly affected by the behaviour of the person chairing or the leader. All of these behaviours like asking questions, asking people what they think, asking specific people questions and so on. And my point, though, is that because a lot of you ask questions, what do I do if my boss doesn't do these sorts of things? Everybody in the meeting can engage in these behaviours. So if you're sitting there in a meeting and you're not the chair, but you notice that someone else hasn't spoken, there's nothing wrong with you saying, Mary, I'd love to hear what you think about this, or whatever. You can role model to your boss how you think it's good to draw out that participation. This will be my last point, and then I'll pass on. Remote meetings are a unique challenge, and I sort of indicated here that we all understand that remote is generally not as effective for meetings, but we love it anyway. Why do we love remote meetings? We love remote meetings so we can multitask, but we're actually kidding ourselves because we're really not doing either task very effectively. So if you are running remote meetings, I think you have to put in even more time and effort to thinking about how we're going to make it actually work from a participative perspective. And you will need to be, if you're the facilitator of a remote meeting, more active in your facilitation. So the sort of thing you can do, one suggestion, this comes from Steve Rogelberg's book, consider asking people not to be on mute. Now, that's interesting because I just asked you all to be on mute. But the idea here, if you've only got 7 or 8 people in the meeting, if you ask people to be on not on mute, you're actually asking them, make sure you're in a quiet space so we can all talk, you know, instead of having to mute and unmute. And also, of course, when people are on mute, sometimes it means they're in an environment where it's noisy and they're distracted. and they're not fully present. You might have a roll call, because what you want to try and do is get people talking. So you might ask people to very quickly introduce themselves, because you want to get people talking in that forum and present and part of that meeting. Try and use people's names, again, for the same reason. Ask specific questions of specific people. Those generic questions, what do you think we should do here? Not targeted at anyone, very broad. Again, you're going to invite the more dominant people to be coming forward, but you should be more directive if you can. And that's part of drawing out the quieter people. Leverage the technology. Steve is a fan of saying it shouldn't be for side chats. So, you want to avoid the situation where there's a whole big side conversation going on, and therefore people are not present in the meeting. But it might be a way that people can say, oh, I've got an idea, so that someone can say, oh, okay, Jerry, let's hear your idea, or whatever. And consider breaking the meeting up. So this just is the idea of, you might, for example, do something like say, well, let's have 15 minutes where we frame the problem. And that's the 15 minutes. And then everyone go off and do individual brainstorming, and then collate that individual brainstorming, and then share the ideas. And then you might come back for the process of choosing how to move forward. So you might consider sort of more short meetings rather than lots of big meetings. And of course, ask for feedback. I'll end where I began, which is that sometimes we think meetings are going great. What we might want to do is actually ask, what could we do to improve engagement in this meeting, and just spend 5 minutes as an agenda item on that topic. So I would love you to just, I've talked about a lot of stuff here, lots of different ideas. If there's one little spark of an idea that's come into your mind based on what I've talked about so far, just pop it into the chat or into the Slido. What's small change? And remember, we're just talking small. Might be have an agenda, simple as that, or it might be rotate the role of chair or whatever. What small change based on what I've said so far might you consider for improving your own meeting success? So just going to give you a couple of seconds to do that. And then I'm going to introduce Jenny. Shorter meetings could be a simple one, for example. I have a lot of 15 minutes. People will tell you. Okay, so hopefully we've got a few ideas in there. I'm absolutely delighted now to introduce you to, as I said earlier, one of our inaugural ARC Laureate Fellows, identified in the very first round of Laureate Fellows, Professor Jenny Martin. And she will tell you a little bit about herself. You can see that she is a renowned protein crystallographer. But what you can also see from the bio here is that she is a major contributor to gender issues in the area of science, as well as a strong public advocate for science. So absolutely delighted to have Jenny here, and she's going to share some of her thoughts with us all. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides when I get my act together, and we will go to Jenny. So thank you, Jenny. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Sharon, and thanks for that very impressive talk on meetings and how to make them more effective. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Excellent. So yes, I'm a former Laureate Fellow in the original inaugural list of Laureate Fellows. I'm currently on a gap year, which I'm very excited about. So that's why I've got a bit of time to be involved in things like this, and I'm really pleased to be here and to see so many people on this meeting about meetings. I don't have too much to add to what Sharon has already said, but I do want to spend about five minutes or so on what I think is important in meetings. They've already been said by Sharon. I'm just reinforcing some of the messages. So the first most important thing is everybody in the meeting needs to know the purpose of the meeting. And everybody in the meeting needs to know the expectations of them in the meeting. And if they're not clarified, that is a recipe for a not very positive meeting. Meetings can be for any number of reasons. You might be having a meeting with a PhD student. You might be in amongst some of your peers trying to brainstorm how to, or brainwrite, how to address COVID disruption. You might be setting a new strategy for your unit or the university. You might be trying to develop new ideas for addressing gender equity and diversity. You might be on a grant review panel. All of these are meetings that will have their own purpose and their own structure and expectations. I wanted to give one example of meetings that I ran for my own lab for many decades, and it did evolve over time. We would always have an agenda for our lab meetings, and the lab meetings always included a talk from someone in the lab. They could choose to talk about their own research, they could choose to talk about a conference they'd been to, or they could choose to talk about a paper that they'd read that everybody should be aware of. And that would take 15 to 20 minutes. There was always a chair of the meeting, and as Sharon said, we always rotated the chair. From an undergraduate right up to me would have opportunities, 2 or 3 opportunities during the year to chair the meeting. And the role of the chair was to generate the agenda, and the agenda was contributed to by every member of the team. So anybody who wanted to put an item on the agenda could do that, and they would be responsible for leading the discussion on that agenda item. We also had a couple of common agenda items, so tips and tricks. If anybody had found a new idea that they wanted to share with everybody, then they could put that on the agenda. And we always had a result of the week. So result of the week was really to make a more positive atmosphere in the lab meeting. So to get result of the week, you couldn't nominate yourself. You could only nominate other people in the lab for something that they'd done. They might have grown a crystal, they might have purified a protein, they might have had a paper accepted, whatever. So you nominated the person to the chair then contacted the person being nominated, and they had to provide one slide, which they would then talk to about their great result. And then at the end of all of the nominations, we would select the winner. We wouldn't vote because that leads to all sorts of cliques forming. So instead of voting, we would just select a name out of a hat. And the winner got a little trophy to put on their desk, and they got to have coffee with me one-on-one. I'm not sure it was much of a win, but that's what we did anyway for many years. We also had action items on the agenda. So from the previous meeting, if there were any actions, they had to come back to the next meeting with who was responsible, what has happened, and when is that action going to be finalised. And similarly, in any new meeting, any new actions that came up. So everybody knew what their role was. There was the chair who had to call for the agenda items, who had to run the meeting. There was the speaker, and there was also a snacker, somebody who provided snacks for the meeting. And again, everybody in the lab, right through from undergraduates through to the lab head, was responsible for taking on each of those roles. So I think that's probably all I need to say at this time, because we're running out of time, and I'd really like to get to some of the questions. There's plenty more I could say, but perhaps I'll hand it back to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I love your idea of the result of the week, by the way. I think that's one many people will be keen to try. So at this point, I'd love to introduce Lucinda Isles, who is a PhD student here at the Centre for Transformative Work Design. And she is going to, I don't know, Lucinda, if you can share the Slido results, yes. and then maybe invite and send some questions our way. Ooh, yeah, sure. Yes. Oh, look, that's what I predicted.
Yes, you were right, of course.
So I'd love to do a little intervention. Sorry, yeah. Lucinda, I was just saying I'd love to do a little intervention and ask this question again in a year's time. and hope to see that there are more shorter meetings occurring. So
Yeah,
thank
shaving
you.
15 minutes off your meeting times each time or something. In terms of Q&A, I'm going to unshare this because I think we've got some really good questions. The first one that I think was touched on a little bit, but it might be useful to get a bit more specific about how to manage it. We had quite a few questions around interrupting people, especially interrupting people who go on tangents or interrupting more senior colleagues. Do you have any advice for junior women that have to manage this kind of thing?
Jenny, go for it.
All right. Well, I guess as chair of the meeting, I'm really strict on time. So I have a reputation for holding people to time, and I am very strict about the structure of the meeting. And so when we get our agenda, especially not so much for the lab meeting, but for other meetings, I ensure that the agenda items have a time period that is associated with them, and I will tell people we've got 5 minutes for this. So discussion now. I want to hear from as many people as possible, and I will interrupt you if you're going on too long. You'll have to take my apology now. So be upfront about it, that we're trying to keep to time. And I think the chair does play an important role in keeping things to time, but also setting the expectation right at the beginning about keeping to time and keeping to the topic as well, and apologising in advance that you may seem rude, but this is actually just to give everybody a chance to speak. So that's how I do it. Sharon, do you want to add anything?
I guess just some of those tips. Look, it's very, very hard if you're the one that's sitting in the meeting and it's a senior person running it. It's very, very hard. So that's the first thing. I think that some of those sort of procedural statements that I suggested before, for example, you could say, that's a great point that you've made. Let's write it down. So, or you can also set up a parking mechanism. So something I often do in workshops. If people are raising red herrings topics, it's like, let's park that and put that on the agenda for next time. But look, it's very hard when it's someone senior. And this is why I think the structure of the meeting is important. So, if you're able to influence the structure and things like rotating the chair position and keeping to time, those things stop that dominant voice happening. So sometimes it is, so think back over those recommendations that we made around the agenda and the rotating of the roles, because if you create the right structure, you minimize the possibility of those behaviors. You might buy that book that I suggested before as a Christmas present and put it in the secret Santa. No, look, maybe that's a bit passive aggressive. I don't know. But you could certainly say, look, I've been on a course on meetings, and I'd like to suggest we try doing our meetings differently or something. Jenny, you have another thought, I think.
Yes, I was just going to say that sometimes there's safety in numbers. So if there's a bunch of you who are more junior who are feeling the same way, I think getting together and having a separate short meeting with the chair and saying, look, we would like the meetings to be run more efficiently, and here's some great ideas. I think that makes it better than just a one-on-one with a senior and a junior person.
Or you could recruit a more senior ally, potentially, who's also in the meeting, to say, we're not feeling we're getting our voice, would you help us figure out a way to influence the chair? So, but look, just want to acknowledge that it's very difficult. Absolutely. Some of those other women in research sessions we've done around influence when you don't have authority, other sorts of also might be sources of ideas. Thanks, Lucinda. Back to you.
We had another one just come through. How to politely suggest to senior colleagues that we have too many meetings and too many long meetings. I think it comes back to that influencing, but do you have anything else to add to that point?
I guess it's the same sort of response. I think, you have to have the conversation. It's not easy when you're when you're junior and you're working with more senior people. But having a number of people together or recruiting the senior person to have that conversation, I think the same sort of strategies may apply in that case, Sharon?
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, look, it's so dependent on your relationship with this person and what that person's like, of course, as well. You know, some people might respond well to seriously some sort of comment of like, oh, I've just read this great book that recommends that meetings should be, you know, half the time we schedule them for. Could we try that or something? But of course, it's going to really depend on that person and how they need to be handled. And people are different. But yes, trying some different strategies, getting people to help, as Jenny suggested, could be a way forward. Role modeling yourself. Look, honestly, also, sometimes I think that I'm pulled up in a meeting when I see someone more junior than me say, you know, well, as an example, oh, Lucinda, what do you think? Because actually that's quite powerful, because that reminds me, oh, I should be doing that actually. But you know, you get caught up in your own little world, and sometimes more junior, and that's why I said those behaviours around trying to foster participation, they don't just have to be the boss. There's no reason why you as a more junior person couldn't say to another junior person, oh, you know, Harry, I know you're really interested in this topic, what do you think? So also, bizarrely, role modelling those behaviours as a junior person can sometimes be quite insightful for a senior person.
Yeah. We had one come through on Slido that said, in the last 4 weeks, I've had 2 no-shows, 4 non-responses, 2 rescheduled at the time of the meeting. How do you foster better respect for each other when it comes to meetings?
I think that comes down to expectations. But can I clarify, does that mean there were 6 meetings, or this was one meeting with a bunch of responses?
Not sure from the question. Maybe the person that asked it might be able to put it in the chat, but would your response be different depending on different circumstances?
Look, I think it comes down to expectations and maybe looking at the purpose of the meeting. Maybe people are thinking that it's not important enough for some reason. Maybe they're not having a say. So maybe look at the structure of the meeting, purpose of the meeting, the expectations, and you know, what are the outcomes? People like to see, I know I do, if you're going to a meeting, that actually something's going to happen and it's not just a talk fest.
Yeah, so I would just say, yes, I think understanding why these no-shows are happening is important, you know, and is it because people, I think these are one-on-one meetings by the look of it, but I think sometimes, of course, people don't go to meetings because they feel they're going to be a waste of time, and you can create that vicious cycle, actually, yeah, and then half the people don't turn up because they think it's going to be a waste of time, then there's only half the people there, so it really is a waste of time. So that's where I think Jenny's point about very clear about the purpose, the agenda, some of those other things about making the meeting, you know, it is a transition, making it important, you know, having a bit of food. I love the snack idea, you know, but so that people, you know, go and are fully present at that meeting, setting the norm. If it's a meeting where people do get on their phones and stuff, ask people not to, or ask people to go out the room if they need to do that, or whatever, you know, taking some of that control. Because if the meetings are not effective, people are not going to turn up. But that may not be the reason. I don't know. That's just something to explore. Why is this happening?
Yes, first seek to understand.
Yeah. I think that the question of big group meetings versus one-on-one meetings, the kind of different dynamics, which is quite interesting. We had a few questions in the submitted questions around structuring PhD student and early career one-on-one meetings and how to make them most effective for the student and the supervisor, because I know for my meetings with Sharon, for example, I love the meetings where we can just kind of chat and talk about ideas, and I get so excited when I leave those ones. But perhaps from your perspective, Sharon, those feel a bit unstructured and less directional.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to see the different dynamics of that.
But I'm okay with that brainstorming, chatting around ideas, actually, so long as we have a clear agenda. So you know that I ask students to bring an agenda. So I don't get involved in the agenda because for me, the students' meetings are for them and about them. So the agenda is dictated entirely by them. I always at the beginning will say, what's our agenda? I like to know the whole agenda so that we can pace ourselves. Because as Lucinda knows, many of my meetings are either 15 or 30 minutes. It's very rare to have an hour. Usually means there's a crisis of some sort. So the sort of chatting about ideas is absolutely fine as long as we know this is what we got to get through in the meeting. And if there's time for that, that's a really important part of supervision, actually. And personally, what I get energized about from supervision is that chatting. So I don't want to imply that structuring a meeting means that the conversation must be very structured and not dynamic and flowing, but it's about creating the space for those energizing, freewheeling conversations because you're managing the time effectively, if that makes sense. Yeah. But Jenny, how do you manage your PhD?
Same. So with student meetings, I require an agenda, usually the day before, so I can think about it. It can just be a bunch of things like, I want to go over this issue that I've found, this gel's not working. I want to talk about my holiday that I'm going to take in a few weeks' time and who's going to look after the cells while I'm gone, or I want to talk about the conference that I want to go to, or I need a new laptop or whatever it is, so that I've got time to think about them as well. And then, most of the time will be spent on the research issue, but some of the other ones I can just say, yes, that should be fine. If you take leave, then we can identify so-and-so to look after the cells and you can do the same for them when they're gone. So it's just making sure that we're agreed about what we're going to talk about. And of course, you can always bring in late-breaking issues, but managing that time effectively and using people's time, with appropriate recognition that time is precious and it's a resource that is in limited supply.
And again, just to add to that, Jenny, Lucinda knows this as well, but, I do always give my PhD students a sort of set of expectations right at the beginning of their PhD, which include, that time is precious and respecting time. And things like I have a rule that if you want feedback on a paper, I need to get it at least 3 days in advance, except in emergencies, etc. So I think, again, having some of it's about establishing the norms of the meeting. I also will always just try and check in on the student too. Again, it's not a big check-in, but just how are they going? What, if I know that they've just moved here, how are they settling in or whatever? So just to also have that little bit of human connection to with them.
Absolutely. And I think having that broader discussion so that everybody has the same expectation about how often you're going to meet and what the meetings will involve, how long they're going to take. And that may change over the course of a PhD. Students should be becoming more self-sufficient and independent and may not need to meet as often. So, those are discussions that are really important to have.
Yeah, so I would typically, new students would be meeting once a week and then going down to once a fortnight, and then even, at Lucinda's stage, it's once a month potentially. So, and again, I set that up at the beginning so that people understand it's not because I don't love them anymore. It's because of the stage, of their PhD. Thank you, Lucinda. I think we've got time for another question. We're getting a great opportunity for questions today, which is terrific.
I didn't think we'd get through this many questions. We normally only have time for one. So let me just have a little slide through the remaining ones.
Can I maybe just add in, if you're finding it difficult to find a question, I remember there was some about having difficult conversations in meetings. And I remember one meeting that I was in where I knew there was going to be a very difficult conversation, and I knew that I was probably going to be cut off. So I practiced all night the night before. I practiced saying, no, you will allow me to finish. And I got that in and I was able to say what I wanted to say. Didn't make much difference, but it made me feel better about the meeting. So sometimes you can prepare in that way as well as reading the papers, but you can anticipate that there may be some difficult conversations.
And Jenny, I love your tip because it's an example of what we mean by a small win. Actually just saying, no, let me finish, please. That may not shift the planet, may have little impact, but you yourself have been assertive, and that is a great thing. So, this is what I mean by small wins. And people, we also had a lot of questions, Lucinda, about people feeling afraid to speak out in meetings. Again, I would set a little goal of and I think I shared this story before when I first went to one of my earlier jobs, and it was very male professor dominated. I in these big meetings, and I felt like I just never said anything. So I made a commitment to say one thing at every meeting, and I would always try and do it early so that then I could relax. But it was amazing how within three to 6 months things transformed, and I was one of the people speaking. Just by that simple goal, even if all I said was, I would just like to endorse the comment of my colleague, I agree. Even if I just said that, nothing contentious, but just to get used to voice. And so setting a very simple goal of I'll speak every meeting or I'll speak every second meeting. And you can speak about something non-contentious as long as you speak. Whatever your particular issue is, think of a little small goal to do that. So I think, Lucinda, if you found one more question, we've got time for one more.
I'm sorry for everyone submitting on Slido. I've got a lot of different pages open on my screens. One that got a lot of upvotes, how to deal with people who are always grumpy and complaining.
Jenny, you can go with that one.
Sure. Look, again, it comes back to this first seek to understand why are they grumpy and complaining. It's not really appropriate to ask in the middle of a meeting, but it might be worthwhile a conversation over a coffee afterwards, because maybe they're always the same, but is there a reason behind that? Is there something that we don't know about? So I try to find out. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's just, a really difficult person for whatever reason, and you just have to work through it. Sharon, you might have better suggestions.
Well, no, I think that's again a tricky one. Remember that research that shows if you engage in those more procedural statements, you can, and hopefully the chair in particular, if it's the chair that's complaining, it's more tricky. But it's sort of like, I guess it is sort of trying to say that we're hearing you, but let's park that, or let's capture what you've said and let's move on. Those sorts of statements. Or, look, this is a much bigger issue you're raising. Let's put that on next week's agenda. Those sort of statements, I think, is probably so trying to reflect and listen, but then shift, because otherwise, if they become those toxic meetings where everybody just starts complaining, and we know that negative complaining is a very strong predictor of meeting failure or unsuccessful meetings. So as a chair, try to shift through those sort of procedural statements. They're not personal. So again, it's not about, shut up, Fred, you're always going on and on. It's, thanks for raising that issue. We need to move on now to get the rest of the agenda ahead or something. Yeah. So looks like we're getting close to everybody wrapping up, and I can see some lovely thank yous. And that's very gratifying to see so many people coming on. At this stage, I will just thank everybody. First of all, thank you for everybody for coming and participating. Love to see your engagement. Love the little happy face I've just got. And keep sending the questions, keep coming. Please remember your small win. Love to hear if you try something as a result of today's session and how it goes. Love to hear that. I'd love to thank Jenny. It's been brilliant to have your insights, and I think you role model perfectly respect for time. We asked you to do 5 minutes, you did 5 minutes, and that created a great opportunity for questions. So thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you, Lucinda. Brilliant as always. And of course, there are women behind the scene that you don't see, Isabel and others. Thank you all very much for being involved today. And our next session, I think, is about women returning to work after extended leave, maternity leave or sabbatical or something. So hopefully we'll have some of you joining us now. I think we're actually 2 minutes early, which I think is a first.
It is.
Yeah, thank you guys. Wonderful to see you, and we'll see you in the next Women in Research.
Thank you.